Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar in which we're going to be looking at how land can be diversified or leased to create habitat banks. I'm Peter Snodgrass, Head of Agriculture at Shakespeare Martineau. I'm joined by Jenny Wielden, Legal Director at the firm, and we're also joined by Alexa Culver, Legal Counsel, and Rob Regglesworth, Principal Ecologist, who are both from the Environment Bank. Welcome to both of you and Jenny.
Hi.
This is a live session, so please put your questions forward during it using Q&A tab that you will see at the bottom of your screen. We will answer as many of these as we can, either during or after the webinar, or if we can't fit it in, then we'll respond after the session. Now, during this webinar, we are going to be discussing habitat creation with our guests, the Environment Bank, who have a specific offering within the biodiversity net gain sphere, and they can offer some practical insights into how they are working with farmers and rural landowners. In this discussion, we will explore also how to navigate the legal implications of entering into these schemes, and we'll be highlighting some of the tax implications of entering into such schemes. So, Alexa and Rob, we will start with you. And Rob, as the ecologist, the expert in this field, please can you say what habitat bank is?
So we'll start with the ecology side of things, and then Alexa will fill in with all the legal questions later on, I'm sure. But from an ecology point of view, a habitat bank really it's a large scale conservation project that's used as a compensation site for biodiversity net gain. This is a space that, as a company, Environment Bank, we've been working in for almost 10 years now. I've been at the company for around 4 years. And we've previously worked on a very ad hoc basis. We've been a broker, essentially, matching when there's been a development impact, housing development, for instance, and they've been required to compensate for habitat loss on that development. We've then had to go out and matchmake effectively a developer with a landowner, farmer nearby to that development and try and offset that impact on that land. And we really had to do it that way in the past because the BNG, the biodiversity net gain legislation, was being applied on kind of a piecemeal basis by certain local planning authorities. Warwickshire, for example, were one that have had a policy already in place, but it was really quite a piecemeal approach. And it's only really now, and we're moving towards this time where the Environment Bill is going to legislate biodiversity net gain for all development across England. And that's going to suddenly open up the market and the opportunity for landowners across England to provide compensation sites for development. And it's really going to help us achieve what we've always wanted to do, which is provide larger scale sites. In the past, when we were operating on this brokerage model, we were really doing things that were comparable to a lot of the countryside stewardship things that are out there. So we were doing a lot of field margins, small sites that were around a hectare or less in some cases, because that's all the demand there was. What a habitat bank allows you to do is to pool demand from several developments together into one site, and that allows you to do things at scale. So we're now able to look at sites that are 40 to 50 hectares in size around the country. We're aiming to bring one of these habitat banks forward in every local authority and just do things at a much better scale that's much more efficient from a planning point of view, in terms of we're not having to matchmake every single time a development comes forward. But from an ecology point of view, as an ecologist, it means that we can do things that are much more exciting ecologically. So we've had the first couple of sites have just gone live in the country now. One of those is a 50 hectare arable site that we're looking to connect up an existing area of ancient woodland with some species-rich grasslands, and we're going to do some scrub creation and that kind of thing on a big scale within the kind of farmed landscape and really make a big impact. So it's an exciting time from an ecological point of view, and it's thanks to this new legislation that's coming in that's allowing us to really take a bit of a different approach and do things at scale.
Thank you, Rob. So Alexa, maybe turn to you now. we've got this biodiversity net gain concept, which is enshrined in statute. So BNG, how does the Habitat Bank deliver BNG in practical terms? How are you going about it?
Good question. So the Environment Act says that there will be a gain site register. And so our habitat banks will be big gain sites. They will be registered on the gain site register once it exists. And it needs to be bound under either a planning obligation or what will be a conservation covenant. Those are all conservation covenants are coming in under the Environment Act as well, very shortly in the next couple of months. And so under that oversight from the responsible body of a conservation covenant or a local planning authority, that site has a habitat management plan. And we agree those plans with the landowners we work with. Rob and the ecologists work really closely with the landowners to set a series of different works to be done to create and enhance and manage those habitats on that habitat bank. And then units are sold to developers, certificates are issued to developers to say you have purchased XYZ units of medium distinctiveness grassland or something similar. And then those certificates are effectively cashed in at the planning authority when it comes to discharging their planning conditions. So hopefully that's a sort of useful oversight.
Lovely. Yeah, that's very helpful. Before we get into the detail about how the Environment Bank specifically get into linking landowners with this BNG delivery, perhaps we should look at some other structures to the Environment Bank structures that are also available. So, Jenny, can you tell us a bit about what we have found at this firm with clients who want to get into this sphere?
Yeah, of course, and it follows a little bit from what Rob said. So Peter and I work in Stratford-upon-Avon, and Stratford-on-Avon District Council has been an early adopter of BNG, and so we've seen them sort of adding this into their planning strategy. So some of the examples that we've come across is where, for example, they've had a development come forward and they've looked to put part of the site into a local wildlife charity. So in that instance, they took a cash lump sum from the house builder as well as part of the site. The wildlife charity went into occupation of the habitat with the funding and management agreement directly with the local authority for that space. Then we're also, with our planning team and developers, we're seeing direct relationships being formed between farmers, landowners and house builders, where the house builders are going out to find them and offer them a sum of money to create a habitat, for example, swallow boxes or something on their farm. In turn, the farmer is entering into a 30-year or more agreement to manage and create that habitat. So yeah, there's some of them. And then in terms of that, I think it's really just been driven through local authority, isn't it? That side of things.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there are other markets which are developing, Environment Bank being sort of one of them. But yeah, do you want to say a word about conservation covenants that you, Alexa, have already referred to?
Yeah, I mean, the conservation covenants, it's something we're expecting to see come through conveyancing drafting, moving away sort of from the planning sphere, and possibly see private investors move into that space, trying to find a way to monetize the covenants that are available. The covenants will be entered into between landowners and responsible bodies, but the legislation, we're not aware of what a responsible body will be just yet. Probably have some ideas, but nothing concrete yet. And then the thought process behind those covenants is that they will be something that is enforced in law, but without sort of the traditional legal entrapments of land law, where you've got positive covenants that then need perpetual deeds of covenant.
Exactly. And just to say, yes, they'll be registrable as land charges like a Section 106. So it will run with the land, just like you're saying, which has always been a big problem in our traditional land law context.
Yeah. So what you're saying is we can cope with it in traditional conveyancing terms through repeating positive covenants and a restriction on the title. But as every conveyancer knows, they are a perfect pain. And if we can do without them, we will be very much better off. And so that will be an immense, I think, in fact, it wouldn't be a bad thing if they could produce these kind of covenants for non-conservation purposes as well. But that's a more, separate
different
thing.
to take up.
Yeah. So that's very good. Yeah. Do you want to, you've got another comment, haven't you?
Yeah, I suppose just to round off in terms of the different models we're seeing, it's fair to say we are seeing some clients explore creating habitat banks of their own, whether they've got the expertise in-house and on their holding want to speculatively create a habitat with a view to building up credits and selling those. And that's why it's so interesting to be talking with Environment Bank today, because you offer a package that follows those sorts of models and supports landowners.
Exactly. I mean, we really, really encourage everybody to get involved in this, because from our point of view, the more biodiversity gains there are out there, the better. We are a good solution and part of the picture for landowners that are a bit more risk averse. So landowners that are keen to just have a fixed income for 30 odd years without any of the risks associated with habitat failure, enforcement of conservation covenants or planning obligations, that sort of thing. We are part of the picture for the less risk, the ones that have less of an appetite for risk.
Okay, Alexa. So I think that's a good point at which you can outline what your typical model is for a landowner who wants to commit and get the benefit of a BNG deal.
Certainly. So if they're choosing not to deliver it themselves and want to go through something like our scheme, it would look a bit like this. We would take a lease of the land where it's an agricultural holding. We would take it through a farm business tenancy to preserve and respect the agricultural character of the land. We would also enter into a farm business tenancy back to the landowner for them to manage the land in accordance with a management plan that our ecologist would work with the landowner to build. So that the ecologist would work closely with the landowner, who really does understand the land better than anyone else does, and come up with a habitat management plan that would really work for that land, that involves the introduction, creation and management of habitats that are absolutely right for that area, right for the overall sort of part of the country you're in, and also good for demonstrating gains through the DEFRA metric. So there's two channels of money that go to a landowner. There'd be the lease payments under the lease, and then there would be the management payments under the management agreement. And so that together then sort of creates the legal structure that takes makes the most of the landowner's operational control of the land, respects the agricultural character of the land, channels the cash to the landowner in consideration for those works and for the lease. And then the ecologists are there to support all the way through to create a plan that would really work and work in the long term.
Okay, quick question. Is it typically an annual revenue that is paid to the landowner, or are there deals where there's an upfront, or is it flexible from the Environment Bank's point of view?
Yes, so the rents would be annual in advance, or we can agree sort of early upfront payments of rents. And then when it comes to the management payments, typically they would be annually, but they could be on a closer frequency depending on what works are carried out and when. And there's a certain amount of seasonality to the works, which is fair to say, isn't it, Rob, that there's certain periods of the year where not much needs to be done.
Correct. And we also pay all the capital costs as well for habitat creation. So any woodland planting, any hedgerows, that's all covered on top of the annual management. So yeah, a lot of the management we do is quite light touch. So we're typically a lot of traditional hay meadow type approaches, which is quite good for a lot of our landowners and farmers who it's still in the farming realm, but it's just a bit more of a traditional way of doing things. And then, a bit of woodland management, a bit of scrub management. Some landowners are testing out a little bit more of a rewilding type approach. It's still kind of managed rewilding. Everything's quite light touch, and we're trying to get it to be quite nature led, I guess.
Okay, right. Okay, Jenny, do you want to give a few angles on the legal implications of entering into this kind of lease?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose the starting point, as Alexa said, is the lease with Environment Bank, and with that FBT. It's a 30-year agreement. I suppose the starting point for any landlord and tenant relationship is making sure that you're comfortable with the tenant. You've done your homework, covenant strength of the tenant, that sort of thing. Then once you're happy that you're partnering in a long-term relationship with an organisation that you can work with, it's then over to looking at your legal title. You
just to say, so this is an opportunity for all of the guests on this programme to look hard at Alexa and Rob and say, are these people we think we would trust? And or do we want to get involved with the Environment Bank? I'm sure the answer is going to be yes. Sorry, Jenny, go on.
And then, in terms of your legal title, are you the landowner? Simple question, but sometimes people get tripped up with that simple point, is are you actually able to enter into and grant a lease? So you need to be checking your title. Make sure if you own the land with relatives, are they on board? Do they also want to enter into the scheme? It's usually a surmountable issue, but you don't want to be disappointed and delaying matters if you find an issue further down the line. For example, if you've inherited the land and suddenly find out that it hasn't actually been transferred over to you.
I was just going to, sorry to interrupt, but I was going to add to that. Really interestingly, you've got this sort of official title where you think you could know who has the control of the land. But one thing we see a lot, and it's really important to us, is that the family is behind it. That the children are behind it, because actually there can be some quite complex trust structures that aren't apparent even from the legal title. So we do encourage anybody thinking about this to feel confident that everybody's on board before going down that road, really.
Yeah, absolutely, Alexa. That's a really good point. And also, along with, if you have got a trust in place, that the trustees have the power within their trust to be entering into this structure. Depending on the age of the trust, there may be certain reasons why actually those trustees haven't got the power to grant a lease. So it's all sort of homework and background research before you take the steps forward with Environment Bank to put a 30-year arrangement in place. And alongside that, really, it's the third-party interest in land and third-party consents that are needed to enter into these leases. So check your title for what are called restrictions. A land registry restriction is something that would prevent you granting a lease or transfer without having got someone else's consent. So typically with farmland, it will be something like if you've got shared access or shared drainage, there's usually a protection measure in place around the costs for sharing those services, and as such that other party needs to consent to any disposals. And so you need to be just checking that you can be entering the lease and you can get those consents. Another person that might need to consent is your lender if you've got a mortgage.
And that can take varying degrees of time, we can tell you.
With it being a new model, lenders being traditionally cautious, getting them on board early is something to bear in mind.
I'd sort of summarise what you're saying is that it's very advisable to get your title in order. I mean, I'd say that as a lawyer anyway, but you don't want to find yourself on the back foot when you want to get into an arrangement. And sometimes, especially with unregistered titles, it can take a long time to get them registered. You find out that assents from people's estates a generation ago were never made. You've got to get the right people to enter into the document to make it regular. So, I mean, it's not just for the Environment Bank, but it's
for our clients as well,
generally,
because this is a financial arrangement as well, and with agricultural transition and us moving away from one payment scheme, and traditionally our clients, we're expecting, will be exploring this as a replacement income. don't find yourself in a point where you're desperate for the money and adding stress onto yourselves because you haven't got these background points in place. And one of the other things whilst you're checking that title area is restrictive covenants, things that prevent you doing certain things on land. So for farmers, traditionally you might see restrictions around poultry or around pigs for obvious reasons, but occasionally there's a really wide covenant in there that not to use it for anything other than agriculture. And there it's just careful discussion with Rob and Alexa when you're looking at what the habitat's going to be as to whether it falls within that definition.
Yeah, absolutely. And
come up for you.
Yeah, and in case it helps, and we think very carefully about this because under the definition of agriculture in the Agricultural Tenancies Act 1995, it describes using land for grazing, for grassland, for growing seeds, for meadows, typically an ancillary woodland, and typically that would be the majority of our habitat banks. Some wouldn't fall into that category, like wholly intertidal habitat banks wouldn't, wholly woodland habitat banks wouldn't, but the majority of ours would, and we know how important it is to preserve that agricultural character.
Have you anything that you'd like to add on, Alexa, on the legal side and the structure? Anything? No.
I don't think so. No.
Jenny?
I suppose that from our end, I think it's the fact that it is a 30-year arrangement, and whilst we've looked very much at landlord considerations, there are other legal considerations around what you are intending to do with your farm and your business going forward, and how this fits into that plan. I touched on before the replacement subsidies that we're seeing. The approach is that it's going to intend to involve stacking, so layering different levels of funding, and you're going to just need to be planning out what you want to do, because whilst some of the funding will be complementary to what you're doing with Environment Bank, others will not be.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it's a really important point.
You there for a moment.
Oh, yeah.
Some of the guests may not have come across the concept of stacking. So, first of all, could you say what stacking is, Alexa?
Yeah, so stacking is effectively like you are layering lots of different potential funding streams for different activities on your land and stacking one on top of the other. And sometimes that's a problem. There'll be different rules that could be broken on different countryside stewardship schemes or, sustainable farming incentives. But for the most part, for example, basic payment schemes, our structure allows that continued claim and it doesn't cause any issues. But with other things, the kind of core principle is, are you being paid twice to do the same thing? And that's what you want to avoid. But we've designed our structure to accommodate complementary activities and complementary funding streams, as long as they are not falling foul of those rules around, are you being paid to do the same thing twice? And the Sustainable Farming Incentive has obviously already quite helpfully pointed out that private schemes can run alongside sustainable farming incentive schemes, and they'll keep it under review, but they expressly say they can. They just want to make sure you're not getting paid to do the same thing twice.
So to apply that, if there is an obligation for the management of the land under a lease arrangement and habitat management agreement with Environment Bank, those actions would not then be funded as well by government. That's that's the understanding. Exactly. And to slightly steal a phrase that was brilliantly used by Jeremy Moody, Secretary of CAAV, and I thought this was brilliant. He said, well, it's the smirk test, isn't it? If you're smirking, you're probably not supposed to be doing it. So and I thought that beautifully explains, if you're finding yourself feeling rather pleased with yourself with a smirk, then you're probably on the wrong side of it. All right. Okay. That's a very interesting test, which would be a wider application maybe in the political world. But anyway, we're not going to go there. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I think the other thing is for people watching that contemplating entering into the Environment Bank model or even any other habitat creations and the timeframes we're talking about is, what are you planning for the future? Is it retirement? Is it next generation? Because potentially it will be those individuals that will be stepping into your shoes with these agreements. I assume that it's fine for the landlord to assign the leases over, so that means someone else can take it over, and potentially this may actually be very welcome. The next generation may be really pleased to see a regular income coming from the land, or on resale, it's there are always land investors, and they may be really happy with a strong tenant covenant for a 30-year period there. So that they're just sort of interesting considerations to have, and talk with your advisors about where you're going and how you see this fitting into things.
Definitely. And I don't know if this is linked to that, but I've just seen in the chat that one of the questions here from Julia is, what if the Environment Bank fails, or an equivalent Habitat Bank operator? What happens to all the 30-year leases? And I suppose that's a really good question, because it's really important, if you are entering into any of these kinds of arrangements, that you're confident that there is a covenant strength for the person that you're entering into, which can be obviously evidenced with proof of funds. But also what we do, and we think this is really central to a healthy system, is we also deposit the full funding for the full maintenance of the Habitat Bank. We deposit it into a separate account and allocate the full funding for the full 30 plus years at the beginning on day one, including funds for contingency in the event of habitat failure. For us, that's really important. We think that those funds need to be there, they need to be ring-fenced, and they need to be safe, because without that, there's a real concern that the habitat banks won't be managed as they should be. They end up just getting encroached on, forming back to being part of the working farm again, or what have you. And we just think it's really important that it's enforced, that there's money is there for the maintenance, for contingency, and importantly, for paying appropriate monitoring fees up to the planning authority or the responsible body. There needs to be a really good, clear stream of cash going up to the monitoring authorities to make sure that the things on the ground are happening as they should be.
And that's really interesting for our landowners that explore this model for themselves, because if they need the cash for a particular other project, that's fine, but it's making sure you've built the contingency to continue managing that habitat into your business plan, because you have got to continue with that, and there will be input costs.
True. Something which we said we would touch on in this event, and I know that we're almost at the end now, but is taxation, and in particular inheritance tax, because agricultural property relief is given if the land is used for the purposes of agriculture. Business property relief is given if the land is used for the purposes of business. And there are going to be grey areas on these fronts. At the moment, there are pushes to change the definition of agriculture for taxation purposes, and the Agricultural Law Association Working Group, which Amy Cowdell in our firm is sitting on, are pushing for a change to the definition of agriculture, both with regard to tenancies and in relation to inheritance tax, to make it quite plain that land use for environmental purposes will not fall foul of that test. Now, this is of extreme importance, of course, to farmers who have been blessed with generous reliefs over the years. What are your thoughts about that, Alexa?
Well, so again, the majority of our habitat banks will fall within the definition of agriculture under the Agricultural Tenancies Act. And we believe that the structure that we're adopting also ensures that the landowners remain in occupational control under a farm business tenancy and are occupying for the purposes of agriculture. There's an annual hay cut. There's often going to be some conservation grazing going on. These are all very much agricultural activities in our view that are also delivering biodiversity net gain. Also, we're encouraged by the government's food strategy. I know that it wasn't completely well received, but one of the things that we were encouraged by was what they describe as the 3-compartment land use for sustainable agriculture. What they say is that for a sustainable food supply, we need to have a combination and a balance between intensive agriculture, land sharing, and land sparing. And we are in the land sharing and land sparing territory, where we're ceasing inputs, we're allowing conservation grazing, and we're improving biodiversity, soil conditions, and similar. So we see that the role of habitat banks in this is part of the government's vision for a sustainable food supply, which to us helps to keep it all in the realms of agriculture, which is where we think it should be. But certainly it's untested, and I can see, it's absolutely something that everybody is calling out for government to give a strong steer on through legislation.
Yeah, we certainly hope for that, because otherwise there certainly will be grey areas, and some environmental schemes are going to fall fairly squarely within the definition of agriculture. Others are going to be on the edge, and the risks might be quite high. Right, we have come to the end of our allotted time, but there are some questions. So I'm going to just go through those that I've got, and let's see. The first one would be about break clauses in these arrangements. And Jenny, I don't know if you want to just say how a break clause operates in a lease, and perhaps why landowners or tenants might want to have one.
So in your traditional lease model, we quite often see breaks, and actually in a long-term lease, like a 30-year lease, that is even more common, usually centred around rent reviews and things like that. But a break essentially is the right for traditionally the tenant to terminate the lease early, but we also in certain situations will see a landlord option to break as well. It'd be really interesting to hear from Alexa as to how those breaks work with Environment Bank, or if you don't have those in your model.
Yes, so we don't have them in our model because from a statute perspective, it's essential that we can demonstrate the 30 plus years maintenance period for the Habitat Bank. So under the Environment Act, Section 100, I think, is the requirement for a Habitat Bank or gain site. It must be managed for 30 years or more. So we don't allow a break because we want to ensure that management continues. That said, there is always scope for situations and arrangements to be unravelled, but we want that to be difficult and in extreme circumstances. Similarly, the responsible bodies and planning authorities would only want to allow a closure of a kind of habitat bank in very extreme circumstances. It would be possible to amend or vary a conservation covenant, but we would say it should be in very extreme circumstances and not for commercial gain reasons, because we need to allow that 30 years to deliver the gains for nature to offset the impacts of development.
Okay, so maybe if you're a landowner who's got land which, for example, might come up for planning, and you're talking about 30 years, so it's a long, long time, and who knows what the planning landscape's going to be like at that point, you might want to think carefully before committing land which you might get residential development on, for example, to an Environment Bank scheme or any other scheme which has got to last for 30 years. So some very careful thinking which has to be done by people before entering into these arrangements. Now, one question which has come up is, and perhaps it's one for Rob, how do typical payments from the Environment Bank compare with traditional FBT rents for, say, combinable cereals? Rob?
Good question. And I may have to divert some of this to Alexa, but we link, it's all linked to the DEFRA farm rent index, isn't it, Alexa, I believe. So we want our rents to be competitive, but without distorting land prices. So I know that a lot of thoughts got into that in terms of not wanting to inflate the price of land artificially in that way. But it does vary depending on habitat type and where we are in the country, and the management payment on top of that also varies. So there is a range, again, depending on the type of habitat that you're creating. In some cases, the vast majority of the cost is in the creation stage, which I said earlier we cover for woodland, for example. And then the ongoing management payment might be lower for that, but we still want to pay above and beyond other comparable schemes like woodland grants and other schemes, because we understand it's a 30-year commitment. So we have to offer a good incentive for it. And then at the top end of the scale, we've got things like hay meadows, which are, I say, more intensive. They're still quite light touch, but you are actively managing them. You might have some conservation cattle on there, or some you're taking a hay cut at least once a year. There's a little bit more to the management, and so that would sit at the top end. So there is a range.
So, okay, that's very helpful, Robin. You've distinguished between the payments that someone will get for the management from the rents. So, I mean, either of you really, Alexa or Rob, how would you say that those sort of work out in relation to each other, or is it such an individual thing that you can't really say? But I mean, to go back to the questioner, for the rental part, if we were able to sort of filter that out notionally, what would the rental part? How would the rental part compare with an arable farm rent?
Yeah. Well, so in case it helps then, so I've got these figures that are very, they are very, very generalized, because it really is so relative to the Habitat Bank and the potential yield. Yeah. But as a very, very, very rough guide, and it could be any range, we might say do about £250 per hectare for the leasehold rents and about £650 per hectare for the management. But that's
in old money. Is that about £100 an acre?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's around that, and this is it's up to that much. So that is the kind of top.
Yeah. Well, like we say that to try and sound really impressive. It doesn't really often get there, but
we have actually come out of the EU, Alexa. But yeah, okay, great. And so maybe more of it's going to be weighted towards the management.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, and we want to maximize the payments to landowners as much as we can. We're kind of, the market hasn't really developed yet for BNG, so we're hedging our bets a little bit, and within the kind of the payment that we charge to the developer side of things, that's got to factor in, as Alexa said before, the whole pot for the entire 30 years. So all the upfront admin and all that side of things. Then there's the management payments, the contingency pots, which are fairly large, because if a woodland completely fails, or we have to replant an entire hedgerow, then we have to kind of contingency all that in there. So all that factors down, and we run it through the model, and then we try and maximize what we can pay out to the landowner once we've taken out those other bits and bobs.
Okay.
And are there penalties though for mismanagement as well? Just as we're on the cost subject. Yeah,
absolutely. So we are absolutely pro penalties for mismanagement. And of course, this will all come out as the conservation covenant starts to unfold and come into existence. So we are hoping, and we want planning authorities and responsible bodies to really be robust in the mechanisms that they put into these conservation covenants about how to deal with repeated breaches of management plans, negligence, failure to reinstate failed habitats. And because we really want to make sure we're not in a situation where people grab a site, flog the units, run off into the sunset, and actually there are no gains for nature at all. And it ends up falling into the kind of scandalous territories of carbon credits and things like that. So we really want responsible bodies to be getting paid properly for their monitoring and enforcement, and for there to be real deterrent. There'd be a real deterrent from people being negligent or feeling that they can just repeatedly breach the terms of their management plan.
Thanks, Alexa. That's good to hear. That the whole scheme may have some integrity and should have some.
But it would fall to us, wouldn't it? As I say, building on that, so we would be responsible. So our management plans are very much, we're trying to get away from some of the criticisms of some of the countryside stewardship schemes, where potentially the grass height has been slightly not what it was in the management plan and things like that. We're trying to get away from that model. So from a kind of relationship with the landowner point of view, we will keep things as flexible as we can. So offer certainty in the management plan at the start, but kind of appreciate that over time things are going to change. 30 years is a long time. So yeah, what Alexa was saying there is we'd be the ones who are responsible. So but our relationship with the landowner who's managing the land on our behalf, we try and keep quite, we don't try and create tension there. We try and resolve issues as early as possible.
Yeah, they would be protected from enforcement in our structure, and we are very pro enforcement.
Okay, we've had another question which breaks down into two questions. So the two questions are, what happens at the end of 30 years? And then the other one is, are payments linked to inflation? So I think the second one is to do with the Environment Bank's own policy. But Jenny, any thoughts about what might happen at the end of 30 years? The whole scheme has run its official course. You've got this beautiful habitat bank up and running. It's delivering all sorts of biodiversity and so forth. And the payments stop. Any thoughts about where that lands you up?
I mean, I'll be really interested to see if Rob agrees with me and Alexa agree with me on this, but my feeling is that we'll have created a habitat, and whilst it won't have the constraints on it from the legal point of view under the lease, I think there's a real chance we might see a different constraint come in from it having a natural habitat designation, for example, triple SSI or something like that, that then means that you won't be able to get to day 30 and get your plough out and just completely put it back to productive land. But I don't know, I may be proved wrong on that. 30 years is a really long time.
It is.
And everyone's desperate for food. Maybe every inch will count. I don't know.
Well, I'll very quickly say one thought here. Again, name dropping Jeremy.
Say we need to be very quick. I feel like Nick Robinson, Radio 4, right?
I got it. Well, just very, very quickly, the government thought long and hard about how long this should be, and people thought, should it be 125 years? Should it be in perpetuity? They decided on 30 because it was a manageable period that people could commit to, that isn't actually that long and isn't so long as to make it inevitable that there would be a designation on the site. So that's part of it. Also, I think in terms of the government food strategy, the idea of land being going from rotation into agricultural supply, again, is also something that may well be what government is envisaging happening when these are happening on agricultural holdings.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and building on that, can I say there'll be amazing soils that have been completely regenerated, and we're not looking at taking on entire land holdings. So this is meant to be a kind of diversification as part of a wider farm. So you will end up with, if it's a meadow, then pollinators that are going to hopefully boost all that, and things that can't necessarily be measured in that same way. But as you say, 30 years is a long time. We don't know what the landscape is going to look like then. I heard someone say, if we're in a position where it makes more financial sense to completely plough up all our habitat banks and put them back down to arable, then potentially the world's in a bit of a dire state at that point. So we're hoping that the government will back up the creation of these with other funding streams that can help with the maintenance, the ongoing maintenance.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. That's very good. Just a sort of one-liner. Are payments linked to inflation? That's about rent review, I suppose. Alexa?
Yeah, we do. We're agreeing
for the
now.
Environment Bank, obviously.
Yeah, certainly. It's an absolutely good question, and it's important that we reach a financial deal that works. So yes, we do agree annual inflation.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar in which we're going to be looking at how land can be diversified or leased to create habitat banks. I'm Peter Snodgrass, Head of Agriculture at Shakespeare Martineau. I'm joined by Jenny Wielden, Legal Director at the firm. And we're also joined by Alexa Culver, Legal Counsel, and Rob Regglesworth, Principal Ecologist, who are both from the Environment Bank. Welcome to both of you and Jenny.
Hi.
This is a live session, so please put your questions forward during it using Q&A tab that you will see at the bottom of your screen. We will answer as many of these as we can, either during or after the webinar, or if we can't fit it in, then we'll respond after the session. Now, during this webinar, we are going to be discussing habitat creation with our guest, the Environment Bank, who